20 years. That's how long I was gone. 20 years rotting inside a dungeon so deep, so dark, so completely forgotten by the rest of the world that the system itself stopped sending me notifications. No rescue, no signals, no contact, just me, the dark, and an endless parade of monsters trying to kill me every single day. And here's the thing that makes this even more insane. When I finally crawled back out, blinking like a man who'd never seen sunlight, the first thing that happened was someone laughed at me. Not a cruel laugh, not a shocked laugh, a dismissive one. The kind of laugh that says, "Who is this old man?" Because outside, 20 years had passed. New hunters had risen, new records had been broken, new legends had been crowned. And me, as far as the entire Hunter Association was concerned, I was a historical footnote, a cautionary tale. The guy who walked into the Abyss Gate on the day it opened and never walked back out. Except I did walk out, and I brought everything with me. My name is Rion Ashveil. 20 years ago, I was 23 years old, the top-ranked A-class hunter in the entire country, and I was standing at the edge of the most dangerous gate the world had ever seen, the Abyss Gate. Rank undefined. That's what the classification board said, not S-class, not SS-class. Rank undefined, because their instruments couldn't even measure what was inside. Everyone told me not to go. My guild leader, my teammates, the association chairman himself grabbed my arm and said, "Rion, there is no record of anyone ever returning from an undefined gate. Let someone else figure it out. Wait for backup." I remember exactly what I said back. I said, "I'll be out in a week." I was not out in a week. Here's what happened inside that gate. The moment I crossed the threshold, it sealed behind me. Completely. Permanently. Whatever dimensional mechanics governed that dungeon, re-entry was a one-way trip. There was no door to knock on from the inside, no emergency exit, no rescue protocol because no rescue protocol had ever been needed before. Everyone who entered a gate like that simply died. I didn't die. That part surprised even me. The dungeon operated on a system I'd never seen before. Most dungeons have a floor structure. You clear the boss, you advance, you exit. This one had no exit condition. It just kept generating. Floor after floor after floor. And every time I cleared a level, instead of opening a gate home, it spawned the next level. Harder. More monsters. Stronger configurations. New elemental types I'd never encountered. Creatures that could mimic abilities. Creatures that could learn from being damaged and adapt in real time. I called it the Cradle. Because whatever god designed that dungeon didn't build it to be cleared. They built it to produce something. And after 20 years, I think I finally understand what. Me. The first 3 years were survival. Pure, brutal, ugly survival. I was A-class going in, which means I had a solid skill set. My primary ability was Void Edge, a spatial cutting technique that let me project blade energy across short distances. Decent range, high damage, fast execution. Against the first dozen floors of the Cradle, it was plenty. Then the floors got creative. Floor 44 introduced creatures with regenerative cores that my Void Edge couldn't sever cleanly. I spent 11 days on that single floor. 11 days fighting things that just kept growing back. No food, no sleep except in short rotations. I won, eventually, by accident. I hit one of the regenerators at a specific angle, at a specific depth, and something cracked inside it that didn't come back. I cataloged that angle, that depth. I experimented. The Cradle, it turned out, was also a classroom. By year 5, I had figured out how to exploit elemental phase states, catching creatures mid-transformation, when their defensive cores were softened. It sounds simple when I say it like that. It wasn't. Figure out how to do that means observe the transformation process 300 times across different creature types, get killed 7 times while testing the theory, survive each death only because the Cradle apparently had some minimum survival protocol baked into its architecture that kept me breathing long enough to learn from my mistakes, and then finally, on attempt number 341, catch a fire class regenerator at the exact moment its core was fluid, and drive your technique through it at an angle that shouldn't work theoretically, but does, because the physical laws inside the Cradle are not completely identical to the physical laws outside of it. That last part took another 1.5 years to fully understand. The Cradle had its own physics. Not alien physics, not so different that human biology couldn't function, but different enough that techniques which were optimized for the outside world had inefficiencies inside. and techniques that would be impossible outside worked perfectly inside the cradle's dimensional frame, which meant that everything I was learning was being learned in an environment specifically calibrated to produce maximum growth. Not the growth you'd get from fighting hard opponents. The growth you'd get from fighting hard opponents in a space that subtly rewarded unconventional solutions and punished rigid thinking. I started making notes. Mental notes first, then physical ones. I found materials on later floors. Not paper and ink. The cradle didn't do anything that convenient, but certain monster types dropped crystallized mana cores that, if shaped correctly, could hold imprinted information. I spent 2 months learning to imprint. Then I started cataloging everything. By year 8, I had developed my Void Edge into something the skill system couldn't even properly name anymore. It gave me a tooltip. It said, unnamed skill. That had never happened to me before. The system just gave up trying to classify what I was doing. I took that as a good sign. What I was doing, specifically, was applying dimensional resonance to a spatial cutting technique in a way that allowed the cut to follow intention rather than trajectory. A normal Void Edge cut went where you aimed it. My evolved version went where it needed to go, threading through defensive layers, bypassing resistances, finding the specific structural weakness in whatever I was fighting, and exploiting it automatically. The system didn't have a category for that because it was operating on a level of abstraction the skill taxonomy hadn't accounted for. I named it myself. I called it null threading. The system accepted the name and flagged the skill as unnamed type, which I assumed was its way of saying, we'll figure out the category later. Later never came. The system never did categorize it. By year 10, I had 11 unnamed skills, and the system had simply stopped trying to classify new ones. Every new technique I developed went straight to unknown type. I had a whole section of my skill interface that just said unknown 11, tap to expand. By year 12, I had cleared 216 floors of the cradle, 216 unique boss encounters, 216 environmental hazards, trap configurations, and monster ecologies. And the dungeon still hadn't ended, still wasn't giving me an exit, but something had changed. I started to notice the floors cycling, not repeating exactly, but pulling from previous configurations and mixing them together, like it was stress testing combinations, like it was running me through scenarios, like it was teaching me something specific. By year 15, I stopped panicking about the exit. I know that sounds unhinged, but hear me out. The dungeon had given me more combat evolution in 15 years than most S-class hunters achieve in a lifetime. My stats were off the charts, not because the system kept awarding me levels, but because the system had run out of levels to give me. I hit the level cap at year 11, level 999, maximum, and the system sent me a message that said, level cap reached. Further growth will be applied to base attributes directly. That was 4 years of uncapped growth before I even thought about leaving. By year 18, I had cleared floor 400. The monsters on those floors weren't even recognizable as dungeon fauna anymore. They were things the world outside had never seen. Theoretical entity types, conceptual threats, creatures made of compressed time or crystallized fear or void space architecture. I fought things that didn't have physical forms and had to invent ways to damage them in real time. And then, on floor 427, I found the door. Not an exit, a door. Different. Ornate. Impossible architecture for a dungeon space. It had a crest on it that I'd never seen, but somehow felt like it belonged to me. And when I pressed my hand against it, the system spoke for the first time in years. Not a notification, not a level alert. It spoke in a voice. It said, "The cradle is complete. Return now, Ascendant." I didn't know what Ascendant meant. I still don't fully understand it. But I pushed that door open, and I walked back out into the world. 20 years to the day. The exit opened in the middle of what used to be the Abyss Gates Observation Plaza. The plaza that used to be maintained, guarded, staffed by the Hunter Association to monitor the gate's status. Now it was a public park. Cobblestones, a fountain, children playing. I walked out of a crack in reality in the middle of a public park, wearing shredded armor that might have been black once, but was now the color of very tired nothing. And a 5-year-old kid looked at me and said, "Are you a homeless person?" I said, "Not anymore." The association found me 20 minutes later. Of course they did. Every dimensional distortion in the country gets flagged immediately, and a gate that had been sealed for 20 years suddenly opening was not a small disturbance. 3 black SUVs, 8 hunters in full combat gear, and a man I recognized, Director Voss Elran. 20 years ago, Voss Elran was the deputy chairman of the Hunter Association, the #2 most powerful man in the organization, and one of the 3 people who'd warned me not to enter the Abyss Gate. Now he had gray at his temples and lines around his eyes, and he was looking at me like he'd seen a ghost, which, to be fair, he basically had. "Rion Ashveil," he said, very quietly. "Director," I said. He stared at me for a long moment, then he said, "Your Hunter ID was declared void 8 years ago. You're legally dead. I'm going to need that fixed." There was a pause. One of the combat hunters behind Voss had his hand on his weapon, not drawing it, just resting there, nervous. They didn't know what I was. They didn't know if I was even still human. And, honestly, from a tactical standpoint, that was smart. Something walks out of an undefined gate after 20 years. You don't assume friendly. I let them run the standard scans. They pointed their equipment at me and made sounds I'd never heard before. Confused sounds. Instruments beeping in ways that clearly didn't match their expected readouts. One of the junior analysts literally shook her device like that would fix it. It wouldn't fix it. The problem wasn't the device. The problem was that my stats no longer fit inside normal measurement parameters. They brought me to association headquarters. Clean clothes. A medical evaluation that took 6 hours because every test result came back flagged for manual review. Strength metrics, off scale. Speed metrics, off scale. Mana capacity, off scale. Skill count, 47 registered abilities, of which 31 were classified as unknown type and could not be categorized. The medical chief, a small, precise woman named Dr. Sari Oan, sat across from me after the evaluations and looked at her clipboard for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up. "Mr. Ashveil," she said, "our system maxes out at SS class. That's the highest classification we have." I nodded. "You exceed it," she said. "By a margin we cannot currently calculate." She said it like she was apologizing, like she was somehow sorry that her instruments weren't adequate. I told her not to worry about it. We'd figure it out. Voss Elran was waiting outside the medical wing, and the look on his face told me the news had already reached him. He didn't look alarmed. He looked calculating. Voss Elran had always been a man who saw opportunity and information, which is why he'd climbed so high in the association. Now he was looking at me the same way a chess player looks at a piece he hadn't expected to still have on the board. "The world has changed significantly," he said. I figured. Public parks where observation plazas used to be. The Abyss Gate collapsed inward 3 years after you entered, destroyed itself. We assumed everyone inside was dead. He paused. There are currently 11 active undefined gates worldwide. We have no hunters capable of clearing them. The strongest active hunter right now is SS class, and even they've been unable to make progress past the first 3 floors of any undefined structure. I let that sit for a second. 11 undefined gates, currently open, currently leaking. "What's leaking out?" I asked. Voss's jaw tightened slightly. "Nothing yet, but the leak rate is accelerating. Projections give us roughly 2 years before the containment threshold breaks, and we start seeing undefined class entities breaching into civilian zones." 2 years? I had cleared 427 floors of an undefined structure. I had spent 20 years fighting things that hadn't even been theorized yet. And now there were 11 gates pouring the same category of threat into the world, and the entire Hunter Association, with all its resources and all its ranked hunters, couldn't push past floor 3. I said, "I'm going to need my Hunter ID reinstated, and I'm going to need a new rank classification." Voss said, "The board will want to evaluate you formally. Standard protocol." "I understand. Schedule it." "The formal evaluation," Voss said carefully, "involves a combat assessment against our top-ranked hunters, for calibration purposes." I nodded. "Sure." He looked at me like he was trying to figure out if I understood what I'd just agreed to. He thought he was setting up a test. He didn't realize I'd just been handed an opportunity. Because here's the thing about being the guy who walked into the most dangerous gate in history and came back out. People assume you're a story, a legend, a historical event, something that happened once and got filed away. They don't treat you like a threat. They treat you like a museum exhibit. That was their mistake. The formal evaluation was scheduled for 3 days later. 3 days that I spent relearning what the world looked like now. New technologies, new hunter rankings, new guild structures. The top 3 guilds currently were Ironspire, the Celestine Order, and a new formation called Vanguard Black that had only existed for 5 years, but had somehow accumulated the highest concentration of S-class hunters in the nation. Vanguard Black's guildmaster was a hunter named Derek Van. 20 years ago, Derek Van had been a C-class hunter with potential. I had known him briefly. We'd done one joint operation before I entered the Abyss Gate, a mid-tier dungeon clear that went smoothly. He'd been good, eager, the kind of hunter who watched everything and filed it away. Now he was S-class, guildmaster of the most powerful active guild in the country. And when the association sent formal notices about my reinstatement evaluation, apparently Vanguard Black submitted a request to observe. I found that interesting. The evaluation arena was a standard association facility, large, reinforced, with mana dampeners along the walls to prevent structural damage. A crowd of about 200 observers, association staff, guild representatives, media. The kind of crowd that shows up when something unprecedented is happening, and everyone wants to be able to say they were there. I walked in wearing clean hunter gear they'd provided. Basic black, no insignia. I hadn't had time to register with any guild. I was essentially a free agent in borrowed clothes, which, honestly, suited me fine. The association fielded 3 evaluators. First, a B-class hunter named Talon, to establish a baseline. Standard protocol, they said. A formality. I dealt with Talon in approximately 4 seconds. Not unkindly. I blocked every one of his attacks without moving my feet, then tapped him once on the chest with open palm force, at exactly the right angle and depth, and he skidded backward across the arena floor, unhurt but completely unable to continue. He sat up, stared at me, and just nodded. The crowd was already quiet. The second evaluator was S-class. A woman named Saya Drax, the association's top combat specialist. Compact and terrifyingly fast, with an ability that let her multiply her physical strikes into layered kinetic chains. She was, by all accounts, the second-ranked active hunter in the country. She came at me with everything, and I'll admit, it was impressive. She was genuinely fast. Faster than most things I'd fought in the cradle, which was a meaningful bar. The kinetic chains she threw at me had real weight behind them, cascading impacts designed to overwhelm defensive responses by hitting at multiple angles simultaneously. I watched each chain, tracked the angles, felt the energy signatures, then I moved. Once. I stepped inside the first chain, let the second one pass where I'd been, caught the third one at the wrist, where the kinetic buildup was at its weakest transition point, reversed the energy flow in about half a second using a technique I'd developed around year 9 in the cradle, and redirected it back into the ground at her feet. The floor cracked. Saya Drax stumbled, caught herself, and turned to look at me. There was a long silence. Again? I said. She did not say again. She stepped back, brought her fist to her chest in the formal acknowledgement gesture, and bowed slightly. The arena was completely silent. 200 people, not making a sound. The third evaluator never stepped forward, just quietly withdrew. Director Voss appeared at the edge of the arena floor and looked at me for a moment. Then he turned to the evaluation panel and said, "New classification designation required. The board will convene." They convened for less than an hour. The new classification they announced was the first of its kind in the association's entire history. Rank Transcendent. Not S, not SS, not any letter at all, just Transcendent. A category created specifically for me because the existing scale didn't have room. I heard the announcement from inside a preparation room, where a junior association staff member was trying very hard not to visibly panic in front of me. He kept straightening papers, rearranging things on his desk, picking up a pen and putting it back down. Finally, I said, "You can ask what you want to ask." He looked up. Young, maybe 24. The kind of person who'd grown up in a world where I was a legend, the hunter who vanished into the Abyss Gate. To him, I was probably somewhere between a history lesson and a ghost. "Are you actually going to clear the Undefined Gates?" he asked. I thought about it for a second. "Yes." "All of them?" "Yes." He stared at me. Then he said, very quietly, "I have a little sister. She goes to school 3 blocks from Gate 9. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say, but I remembered his face. I remembered where Gate 9 was. And when I walked back out of that preparation room, I had a list in my head that was no longer just about records or rankings. And that's when Derek Van walked over from the observer gallery. He moved through the crowd casually, like he owned whatever room he was in, which I suppose was true. Vanguard Black had money, power, and a reputation that made most people step aside. He was taller than I remembered, broader. The years had turned that eager, calculating C-class kid into something polished and precise. He stood in front of me and smiled. It was a professional smile, the kind that communicates friendliness and hides everything else. "Rion," he said, "welcome back." "Derek." "That was extraordinary," he said, gesturing toward the arena. "We've been waiting a long time for a hunter who could handle an undefined gate." A pause. "Vanguard Black would like to formally extend an invitation. You'd have full resources, no restrictions, complete operational autonomy. Whatever you need." I looked at him, the smile, the posture, the carefully chosen words, full resources, no restrictions, whatever you need. He said it like an offer. It sounded like an acquisition. "I'll think about it," I said. His smile didn't waver. "Of course, take your time." He handed me a card with his contact information. "We should catch up properly, dinner sometime." "I have a lot to tell you about how the world works now." I took the card. "I'm sure you do." He walked away, and I watched him go, and I thought about the fact that 20 years ago, on the day I entered the Abyss Gate, Derek Van had been one of the last people I'd spoken to. We'd shaken hands. He'd said, "Good luck in there. Take care of yourself." And then I'd gone in, and the gate had sealed behind me, and I'd been trapped. I hadn't thought much about that sequence of events at the time. I was 23 and invincible, and I'd been thinking about the dungeon. I was thinking about it now. The next morning, the records started falling. Not because I was trying to break them. Not because I had a plan or an agenda. It happened because I went to the association's public dungeon registry and started clearing dungeons, high-level ones, gates that had been sitting in the queue for months because no available hunter had the clearance rating to attempt them. I needed to calibrate, to understand the current difficulty landscape, to figure out where the world's threat level was sitting relative to what I'd been fighting inside the cradle. The first gate I cleared was an S-class, floor 30. Previous record for completion time, 4 hours, 12 minutes. Set 3 years ago by Saya Drax herself. I went in alone, no support, no scanner drones, no team communication system. Just me and my interface and 20 years of muscle memory. The gate's interior was a standard volcanic environment. Elevated heat, narrow passages, fire-type monsters with area of effect breath attacks. In a normal S-class squad operation, you spend the first 2 floors getting your bearings, mapping the layout, identifying threat priorities. Then you move systematically. I didn't do any of that. I moved at a pace the cradle had calibrated me for. Full speed. Not careful speed. Not measured speed. The pace I'd developed on floor 200 and something when the dungeon started throwing me into floor configurations without warning, and I had to adapt on the fly just to survive. The fire-type monsters in this gate were aggressive and fast and capable of genuinely dangerous burst damage. Against what I'd fought in the cradle, they were manageable. I completed it in 18 minutes. The gate clerk who registered my exit time looked at his screen, then at me, then at his screen again. He picked up his radio and said, very carefully, "Clearance time logged at 18 minutes and 40 seconds for Gate Foxtrot 7. That is, confirmed. 1840. I heard someone in the background say, "That's not right," and then a longer silence. I completed the second gate, S-Class, floor 47, in 31 minutes. Previous record, 9 hours, 6 minutes. That one drew a small crowd outside by the time I exited. 6 or 7 association staffers who'd apparently heard about Gate Foxtrot 7 and come to see if it was real. They watched me walk out and didn't say anything for a moment. Then one of them started applauding, realized he was the only one doing it, and stopped. The third gate was the one that really changed things. A dual-boss SS-class structure, the kind of dungeon that required full elite squad deployment. 6 S-class hunters, minimum. The second clearance in history had been a 22-hour operation involving Saya Drax and 5 of Vanguard Black's best, with 2 emergency recovery stops and a post-clearance hospitalization for one of the team members. I did it alone in 54 minutes. I want to be clear, I wasn't sprinting. I wasn't showing off. I wasn't optimizing for time or trying to prove something. I was calibrating, moving at what felt to me like a comfortable exploration pace, learning the new dungeon generation formats, noting the differences from cradle architecture. The dual bosses were genuinely interesting. a paired codependency mechanic where each boss would recover if you damaged them sequentially rather than simultaneously. Clever design. In the cradle, it would have been a tutorial-level encounter, but for the current world's difficulty landscape, I understood why it required an elite squad. I handled the simultaneous damage problem using 2 techniques at once, which is not something a single hunter can normally do. Normal hunters have a sequential skill activation ceiling. Your body can only execute one complex ability at a time. The cradle had spent years breaking that ceiling for me. I activated null threading with my right hand, and a second unnamed skill I privately called Resonance Echo with my left, and hit both bosses at the same moment from different angles. They dropped in 4.5 minutes. The rest was cleanup. By the time I finished the 3rd gate, there was a crowd. Not a small one. Association staff, guild observers, 3 recording crews from Hunter media outlets, and Saya Drax herself, standing with her arms crossed and an expression that mixed respect with something that looked a lot like professional crisis. The kind of look someone wears when everything they've worked toward is suddenly being contextually reframed. I walked past the crowd toward the transport vehicle they'd arranged, and one of the recording crews managed to push a microphone in front of me. The reporter, young, bright-eyed, clearly running on adrenaline, said, "Rion Ashveil, you've broken 3 records today alone. What's your plan going forward?" I thought about the junior staffer with the little sister who went to school near Gate 9. "I'm going to keep clearing gates," I said. "All of them?" "All of them. The records board updated in real time. Every new entry I posted went to the top. Every previous record holder got bumped down a line. I wasn't even trying to optimize. I was fighting at calibration pace, below my actual capacity, learning the new dungeon formats and how they differed from what I'd been dealing with inside the cradle, which meant the real performances hadn't started yet. That news spread fast. By the evening, every major guild in the country had reached out to the association, requesting my contact information. Ironspire sent a formal proposal with a number attached that had a lot of zeros. The Celestine Order sent someone in person, a polished representative who made it clear they could offer things money couldn't buy, including political cover and association board influence. Vanguard Black sent nothing. Just a text from Derek. "Dinner? Tonight?" I declined. Said I was busy. Which was true. I was busy looking into something. The Abyss Gate collapse. The official record said the gate had destabilized 3 years after I entered, collapsed inward, and destroyed itself. Clean. Contained. End of story. But when I pulled the detailed incident reports, which took some doing, because they were archived in a restricted tier I technically didn't have clearance for yet, and which I accessed anyway using a skill I'd developed in year 14 of the Cradle that let me perceive and interact with information constructs directly, the details were different. The official summary was 3 paragraphs. The underlying data archive was 470 pages of gate behavior readings, mana flux measurements, dimensional stability indices, and observer logs. The kind of documentation that gets filed and never read because the conclusion at the top already says what happened and no one goes digging. I went digging. Page 212. A mana flux anomaly recorded 48 hours before the final collapse. An injection of external energy into the gate's dimensional frame. Not from the inside, where I was, but from the outside. Somebody standing at the gate's exterior point of contact and pushing power into the frame's structural architecture. Why would anyone do that? There are exactly 2 reasons to inject mana into a gate's dimensional frame from the outside. 1. To stabilize it. Emergency reinforcement when a gate is showing early collapse signs. 2. To accelerate the collapse. To take a gate that's already weakened and push it past the threshold faster than natural degradation would manage. The gate had been showing 0 pre-collapse indicators before this event. The stability readings were normal right up until the injection. Whatever happened to it afterward happened because of the injection. The collapse wasn't natural. There were trace readings of deliberate energy manipulation in the gate's dimensional frame. Someone had accelerated the collapse, from the outside, on purpose. 48 hours after I entered. They'd waited 2 days, maybe to see if I'd come back out on my own. When I didn't, they made sure I couldn't. Someone had sealed me in. I sat with that for a long time, longer than I expected to. I thought I'd been prepared for something like this. I'd had 20 years to consider every possible reason the gate hadn't opened from the outside, and deliberate sealing was always on the list. But thinking abstractly about a possibility and reading the proof in a corrupted archive at 11 o'clock at night are 2 different experiences. Someone had known I was inside. Someone had reached the gate after I'd entered and had pumped energy into the frame specifically and precisely to make sure it stayed sealed, to make sure I stayed inside. And they'd done it with enough skill to make it look like natural degradation on the summary level, something only a very knowledgeable and precise person could manage. The energy used wasn't generic. Mana has individual characteristics the same way fingerprints do, not perfectly unique, but identifiable to a category. Combat class mana with spatial resonance characteristics. Spatial resonance was a specific subtype, rare. The number of hunters capable of producing spatial resonance mana at the level required to affect a gate's dimensional frame could probably be counted on both hands. 20 years ago, who had that capability? Who had been at the gate site within that 48-hour window? Who had the knowledge to do it cleanly enough that it looked like natural degradation in every summary level report? I thought about that handshake. Good luck in there. Take care of yourself. Derek Van had always been exceptional at spatial type abilities. Even when he was C-class, it was the one area where his capabilities were disproportionate to his rank. It was something I'd noticed and filed away during our joint operation. Interesting skill profile for a C-class, I'd thought. Now I thought about it differently. Vanguard Black's combat signature ran on spatial resonance. Every elite hunter they'd recruited specialized in spatial type abilities. Their entire guild's aesthetic was built around it. And Derek, their founder, their guildmaster, was the most naturally gifted spatial type hunter in the country. 20 years ago, when he was supposedly still C-class. I closed the archive file, closed the secondary data files, sat for a moment in the quiet of the association's temporary housing room they'd assigned me, looking at a wall that was a perfectly normal wall and thinking about 20 years I'd spent in a place I was never supposed to leave. Then I picked up the card Derek had given me, the dinner invitation, and I smiled for the first time since I'd walked out of that dungeon. This wasn't going to be a reunion, it wasn't going to be a negotiation, and it definitely wasn't going to be Vanguard Black acquiring the world's only transcendent ranked hunter for their operation. This was going to be a reckoning. But I had to be careful. Derek had 20 years of build-up behind him, 20 years of resources, alliances, political connections, and information. He'd watched me emerge from that gate, watched the evaluation, watched the records fall. And he was smart enough to know that the man who walked out was not the same man who walked in. He was already calculating, already adapting. He didn't know what I'd learned in the cradle. He didn't know the 47 skills. He didn't know the unnamed techniques. He didn't know about the ascendant designation the dungeon itself had given me, or what it implied, or what the door on floor 427 actually represented. He thought he knew enough. He didn't know anything. I sent a message back to Derek. Dinner tonight, your choice of location. He picked a restaurant on the 48th floor of a downtown tower that Vanguard Black apparently owned. Private dining room, beautiful view, the kind of setting designed to communicate power and make guests feel marginally smaller. I got there early and waited. He arrived exactly on time, which told me he'd been nearby, not arriving fresh from somewhere else. He'd been watching for my reply. He'd been ready. The polished smile was back, and behind it, something careful and assessing. The restaurant was exactly what I expected. Minimalist, expensive, the kind of place where the lighting is designed to make everyone look important and the windows are positioned to make the city look like something you own. A private dining room on the 48th floor, glass on 3 sides, the city glittering below us like scattered coins. I'd arrived first. The staff treated me with that particular blend of professional warmth and barely concealed confusion that comes from recognizing someone famous but being uncertain about the protocol. They'd set the table for 2 and brought water without being asked, and then retreated to a respectful distance and left me to look at the city. I spent the time I was waiting thinking about what I wanted from this dinner. Not what I was going to say. I knew roughly what I was going to say. What I wanted. And the answer was complicated. I wanted answers, obviously. I wanted to understand the full shape of what had been done to me and why. I wanted to look Derek in the face and see if he showed guilt, calculation, or nothing at all. I wanted to take his measure as he was now, 20 years into building an empire, because the Derek I remembered was a kid with potential and a sharp eye and very specific skills, and the Derek who'd walked across an arena floor toward me with a professional smile was something considerably more constructed. He arrived exactly on time, not 1 minute early. Not 1 minute late, which told me he'd been nearby, watching for my reply. He'd been ready. He sat down. The professional smile was in place. His clothes were exactly right. Not ostentatious, not understated. The precise midpoint that said wealth and taste, without requiring anyone to be impressed by either. He was very good at what he'd become. We ordered. We made small talk. He asked about the cradle, what it was like, what I'd seen, how I'd survived. I gave him enough. Not everything. The broad strokes of survival, some of the physical challenges, the way the dungeon shifted and evolved, enough to seem open, enough to let him think he was building a picture. He was building a picture. The picture he was building was wrong. Then he leaned back, set his wineglass down, and said, "I want to be direct with you." "Please," I said. "The world needs what you can do," he said. "The Undefined Gates are opening, 2 years out, maybe less, before they become catastrophic. The association is bureaucratic and slow and politics-driven. Vanguard Black is none of those things. We can mobilize, we can resource, and with you leading the charge," he spread his hands, "we can actually solve this." He was good. Genuinely compelling. I could see how he'd built an empire in 20 years. The mix of authority and apparent reasonableness. The way he framed everything in terms of necessity and shared purpose. I looked at him across the table. "Tell me something," I said. "What really happened to the Abyss Gate?" "A beat? Very small. Most people wouldn't catch it." "It destabilized," he said. "Natural gate collapse. We've seen it with a few others since then." "Have you?" "It's in the reports," he said. "I read the reports," I said. "I also read the data underneath the reports." Another beat. Slightly longer, his expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. The professional smile was still there, technically, but the temperature in his eyes dropped by several degrees. "I don't know what you think you found," he said, "but you were inside that gate for 20 years, Rion. It was a traumatic situation. Pattern recognition can get overactive after extended isolation." "I don't think I found it," I said. "I know I found it. The energy signature of a spatial-type mana injection, dated 3 days after I entered the Abyss Gate. Time to accelerate the natural degradation cycle and lock the dimensional frame permanently." "Silence! That's a serious accusation," he said. "It's a statement of fact," I said. "The accusation is, you tried to bury me in there. And I'd like to understand why." Something changed in his posture. The polish didn't disappear, but it reorganized. The man who'd been presenting himself as a reasonable partner was still there, but now, he wasn't pretending it was the only version of him. "You were going to be the greatest hunter in the world," Derek said. "You were 23 and already better than anyone who'd come before. If you came back from that gate," he stopped, considered his words, "the landscape would have been very different." "You mean your landscape?" He didn't answer. "You built an empire in 20 years, I said. Top guild, political leverage, association influence, and the absence of the one person who might have outpaced you was very convenient." He picked up his wineglass, drank from it, set it down. "You can't prove it," he said. "The data is 20 years old and partially corrupted. You pulled it from a restricted archive without authorization. Anything you present is inadmissible and circumstantial." "I know," I said. He looked at me. "Then what exactly are you doing here tonight, Rion?" I leaned forward. "I'm here," I said, "because I want you to know that I know. That's all. No legal case, no association complaint, no dramatic confrontation." I paused. "I spent 20 years in a dungeon that was supposed to kill me. It made me the most powerful hunter in the world. You gave me that." I looked at him steadily. "So thank you for that." He stared at me. "And for everything else," I said. "We'll settle it in the gates. The Undefined Gates. The 11 open ones you just told me about. I'm going to clear all 11, and I'm going to do it without Vanguard Black. And when the world is watching and the records are broken and the crisis is resolved, everyone is going to know who did it and who didn't." I stood up, picked up my jacket. "And then," I said, "we'll talk about the archive data again. By then, I'll have had 20 years worth of time to piece together a cleaner evidence chain." A pause. "Oh wait, that's how long you had too, isn't it?" I left the restaurant. Outside in the cold night air, the city spread out below me in towers of light and shadow, and I could feel the faint resonance pulses from 2 of the Undefined Gates. They were far enough away that no civilian would notice, but to me they were as obvious as searchlights. Enormous, churning sources of dimensional energy, pouring potential threat into the world, while the best available hunters bounced off their Floor 3 boss encounters and filed reports about insufficient firepower. I walked a few blocks before I reached out with my perception, a skill that had no name, that the system had flagged as unknown type, that I'd spent 3 years developing inside the cradle, specifically because the later floors had stopped giving me anything to visually track, and I'd needed to be able to sense threats through walls, through floors, through dimensional barriers entirely. I touched the nearest gate's energy signature and read its interior structure. Floor 3. The hunters were struggling with Floor 3, not because they were weak. S-class hunters are not weak. The records they'd set, the gates they'd cleared, the career achievements pinned to their profiles were real. Drax's record times for standard gates were extraordinary by any pre-cradle standard I'd known. But an undefined gate doesn't scale like a standard dungeon. It doesn't follow the same rule set. The entity types inside an undefined structure operate on fundamentally different threat parameters, and without the 20 years of exposure I'd had to those parameters, even the best active hunters in the world were essentially trying to fight something in a language they'd never heard before. I had been speaking that language for 2 decades. I had cleared floor 427. Floor 3 should not give me trouble. I was fairly certain about that. What I didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was what waited on the floors above the current record. What level the undefined gate threat would escalate to, whether the things inside them were comparable to what I'd faced in the cradle, or whether they were different in ways I hadn't anticipated. The only way to find out was to go in. There were 11 gates. 2 years before catastrophe. 1 transcendent ranked hunter, classification unprecedented, skills uncategorized, potential currently unmeasured, and 1 man who'd tried to erase me from the world, now watching from a tower 48 floors up, recalculating. The evening air smelled like a city that didn't know how close it was to the edge. I started walking, no destination in particular. I just walked, and the city moved around me, people heading home from restaurants and late offices and social events, completely unaware of the dimensional resonance humming below the threshold of human perception. Normal people living normal lives, in a world balanced on the edge of something none of them had been told about. I thought about the junior staffer's little sister. 3 blocks from Gate 9. I walked. I had records to break, I had gates to clear, I had a world that needed what only I could give it, and a past that needed to be answered for. And there was a system message still sitting unread in my interface, flagged since the moment I stepped through the cradle's final door and marked as high priority and never opened because I'd had too much else happening, and because, honestly, part of me had been afraid of what it said. I stopped on a corner. A streetlight buzzed softly above me. No one else around. I opened the message. It said, "The Ascendant has returned. The final cycle begins. Prepare." I looked at that message for a long moment. Read it 3 times. Read the timestamp. It had been sent the instant I pushed that door open on floor 427, not sent by the cradle's internal system. The sender designation was blank. Unknown origin. Final cycle. I'd heard the term once before, in that voice that spoke from the door. The one that said, "The cradle is complete. Return now, Ascendant." 2 phrases, and both of them contained concepts I didn't have full context for. Ascendant, which apparently meant me, a designation I'd earned by clearing a dungeon that was designed to produce one. And final cycle, which implied there had been previous cycles, which implied a larger structure, which implied that what I'd just spent 20 years surviving was one step in something considerably bigger than one dungeon. I knew what it meant. I didn't want to put it into words yet. But I knew. The cradle wasn't the point. The cradle was the preparation. The 11 undefined gates weren't the point either. They were the field. Whatever was coming, whatever the final cycle was, it needed someone who'd been built by 20 years in the deepest, most brutal, most specifically designed evolutionary engine ever constructed. It needed an Ascendant, and there was exactly one. The city lights burned bright against the dark sky, and somewhere beneath them, deep in the bones of the world, something was waking up. Something that had been patient. Something that had been waiting for the cradle to finish its work. Something that was now reading the same timestamp I was, and knew that the Ascendant had stepped back into the world, and was already adjusting its timeline accordingly. I had no idea how much time I had, but I'd spent 20 years in worse situations with no clock at all. At least now I had a notification. I closed the message, put my interface away, squared my shoulders in the cold air. Whatever the final cycle was, it was going to have to come find me. Because I was done being trapped, done waiting, done surviving. I was no longer the man who walked into that gate not knowing if he'd come back. I walked back out. I always walk back out. And I was no longer the kind of man anything could trap. The next morning, I went to the association's operations floor at 6 a.m. and personally filed the clearance request before the duty officer had finished her coffee. She looked at the form, looked at me, looked at the form again. I had filled in the gate designation as Undefined 7, the team size as 1. My own name in the Hunter field, certification number reinstated by the board 2 days ago. She stamped it without a word. Maybe she decided arguing wasn't worth it. Maybe she'd seen the evaluation footage. Maybe she just needed to go back to her coffee. The clearance request went live at 6:14 in the morning, and every hunter, every guild master, every association board member, every media outlet monitoring the operations database stopped what they were doing and looked at the notifications simultaneously. Rion Ashveil, Transcendent Class, Solo Attempt, Undefined Gate 7, no support team, no observers, no backup protocol. Solo. The registration board had a comment field. Standard procedure, optional, usually left blank. I filled mine in with 3 words. I'll be back. The notification rippled through the hunter community like a stone dropped in still water. Forums exploded. Media outlets scrambled. Every active S-Class hunter in the country pulled up the same registration and read it, and then did the same thing, stared at it. Reconsidered their position in the ranking, had a quiet moment with themselves, and somewhere across the city, in a tower full of polished surfaces and carefully constructed power, the man who'd tried to bury me in a dungeon 20 years ago looked at that same notification on a screen and felt something shift in his chest. Derek Van had spent 2 decades building toward certainty, toward a world shaped to his hand, toward a future where Rion Ashveil was a closed chapter, a cautionary tale, a historical footnote that had long since stopped mattering. He looked at the registration, Rion Ashveil, Solo, Undefined Gate 7, and finally, for the first time in 20 years, he felt something he hadn't let himself feel since the day he'd stood at that gate and watched me go inside and made sure I couldn't come back. Fear. Real fear. The kind that comes not from uncertainty about the future, but from certainty about it. The kind that arrives when you realize the person you thought you'd removed from the equation is not only back in it, he's rewriting it. The notification sat on his screen, and down in the city, on a street that smelled like morning and cold air and everything that had been waiting 20 years for me to come back to it, I was already moving toward Gate 7. The records hadn't even really started yet.